Welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. I'm Kerry Schertz, the Backyard Professor. I've recently had a very interesting accusation thrown against me in these videos that I really do seek and desire to address, because the accusation is completely wrong-headed in that my presentation of some of the biblical scholars' materials on the Gospels and on the New Testament, the nature of our scriptures that we have in our Bible, this particular person has said is the atheistic argument. And I'm stunned by such an ignorant approach to what the scholarship is saying about the Gospels. Now, the reason, so far as I can understand from his own words, is that this person thinks that the Gospels are direct eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus as they experienced it with him, while James Dunn, the gentleman I was discussing, in his book Unity and Diversity, among a host of other scholars, has noted that none of the Gospels are original eyewitness accounts or documents, and they were not written during Jesus' lifetime at all, but they are 1 and 2 generations removed. He claims that this argument is wrong and that it's an atheistic argument. Now, in order to combat that kind of a claim, I have evidence that I want to provide. Now, of course, I have serious doubts that it's going to convince this person. I'm not interested in convincing him. I'm interested in showing you the evidence that this argument about the Gospels not being written while Christ was alive is not the atheistic argument. Now, atheists may use it with the either spoken or unspoken assumptions that this proves Jesus didn't exist, but none of the biblical scholarship that I'm aware of says this. None of it at all. They're not saying because the Gospels were written later, this is proof Jesus is just a made-up fiction. They're showing the actual historical nature of the Gospels in a realistic manner. And the astonishing thing is that this argument, this discussion concerning the time that the Gospels were composed, comes from the early Christian church fathers. It's not an atheist argument at all. It's an early Christian argument and discussion about the actual nature of the Gospels. So let me demonstrate with some evidence. Helmut Kester, The Ancient Christian Gospels, Their History and Development. Kester is a fine New Testament scholar. He notes on the story of the Johannine Gospel on page 244. The oldest fragment of the Gospel manuscript that has come to light is a small piece of a papyrus containing a few verses of the Gospel of John in the New Testament. It was written in the first half of the 2nd century. He notes on page 246, John's Gospel is not well known elsewhere. Ignatius of Antioch. Now, this Ignatius of Antioch is one of the early Christian church fathers, just so you're aware of that. Although his theological language is closely related to that of John, does not seem to know John's writing. Nor is the Gospel of John known in Asia Minor before the middle of the 2nd century. Polycarp of Smyrna, Papias of Hierapolis, and the pastoral epistles, written in Ephesus after the year 100, never refer to it. In Rome, neither 1 Peter nor 1 Clement nor Justin Martyr reveal any knowledge of the 4th Gospel. However, later in the 2nd century, this Gospel begins to be used also in Asia Minor and Rome. The dating of the Gospel is not in Jesus' day. In the Synoptic Gospels, he notes the story of the Gospel of Mark on page 273. Although a rather early date has been assigned to the Gospel of Mark, Mark's Gospel appears for the first time in the oldest extant manuscripts containing all of the 4 canonical Gospels, which was written in the middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era. No other manuscript evidence for Mark exists before the 4th century. There are also certain quotations from the Gospel of Mark before There are no certain quotations, I should say, from the Gospel of Mark before Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus, the last 2 decades of the 2nd century. He notes there is a noteworthy reference to the Gospel of Mark with an explicit mention of its author in the fragments of the writings of Bishop Pius of Hierapolis before the middle of the 2nd century, which are preserved by Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history. Eusebius was one of the early Christian church historians who wrote the magnificent sweeping history of the church. It is reported by Papias as a statement of one of the presbyters. Now, I have Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. I can absolutely verify that Helmut Kester has quoted and used this source right. I have the Eusebius history opened to this specific reference right there on the floor in front of me. I just read it this evening. Mark became the interpreter of Peter. This is what Papias said. And wrote down accurately all that he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord. Not indeed in the right order, because he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him. But later on, as I said, he had followed Peter, who used to give his teachings as demanded by necessity, not, however, in order to make a composition of the words of the Lord. Thus Mark did nothing wrong in writing down individual pieces just as he remembered them, for only in one thing did he give his attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard, and to make no false statements in them. Thus, Mark's Gospel was known by the name of its author no later than the middle of the 2nd century. Both Matthew and Luke, written just before or shortly after the year 100, of the Common Era, have used Mark's Gospel and have copied large portions of its text, albeit with numerous editorial alterations. The idea that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, that they were written later, and that the authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are simply from church tradition, they were not the eyewitnesses, is absolutely nothing of an atheist argument, but it is the early Christian understanding. To say this is the atheist argument is patently absurd. We have the historical information on it. The Gospel of Matthew, in contrast to the Gospel of Mark, Kester says on page 314, the Gospel of Matthew is quite well attested in the earliest tradition of the Christian communities. There are 2 early papyri written about 200 of the Common Era containing at least the fragmentary text of the Gospel of Matthew. On page 315, in the middle of the 2nd centuries, quotation from the text of Matthew's Gospel are clearly in evidence. The sayings collection used by the author of 2nd Clement is based on the text of Matthew and Luke, and probably of an apocryphal source. Now, Matthew is the name of an author of a writing, appears for the first time in a fragment of Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, who lived in the first half of the 2nd century. Papias says, Matthew composed the sayings, the talogia, in the Hebrew language, and each translated them as best he could. This is in the Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History 339:16. He says on page 318, now Kester is a fine New Testament scholar. He is not an atheist. He has studied the early Christian literatures and translates the Greek of the New Testament incredibly well. He has written many, many excellent books. We do not know the author of this gospel. He says that point blank on page 318. That the original composition of the Matthew's gospel was in Greek and that it was dependent upon earlier Greek sources makes it highly unlikely that Jesus' disciple, Levi Matthew, wrote the gospel which bears his name. That is the facts of history and scholarship, as opposed to the idea, which is more of an ideology for whatever reason, that these have to be eyewitness accounts. The Gospels do not have to be eyewitness accounts written in Jesus' day in order for Jesus to have validity. Perhaps that's where the fear comes from of not having them as eyewitness accounts. It's an unfounded fear, however. As pertaining to the Gospel of Luke, he says on page 332, no manuscript preserves the work of Luke in its original form. In other words, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles together. In even the earliest extant manuscripts from circa 200 AD, the work has already been split into two sections. However, on page 334 he says, however, there is evidence for the existence of some Western text readings as early as the middle of the 2nd century. Nothing is said about the Gospel of Luke in the fragments of Papyrus of Hierapolis, which was preserved in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. But it is widely attested that just before the middle of the 2nd century, Marcion used this Gospel as the basis for his edition of Christian Scriptures. The report about Marcion's use of Luke appears for the first time in Irenaeus, which is 180 AD. And according to them, he mutilated the Gospel of Luke. Thus the Gospel of Luke, perhaps written as late as the first decades of the 2nd century. Notice this is not written while Jesus was alive. It could have been as late as the first decades of the 2nd century, became the first Gospel to be elevated to something of a canonical status in the early Christian Marcionite edition. The name of the author of the third Gospel of the New Testament canon never appears in such contexts. Evidence for this Gospel as a separate writing under the name of Luke appears for the first time in Irenaeus, 180 AD, in his discussions of the origin of the 4 canonical Gospels. And Luke, who was a follower of Paul, put down in a book the Gospel that was preached by Paul. Isn't that interesting? The Gospel of Luke is about the Gospel of Paul. It's not an eyewitness account at all, according to Irenaeus. It's interesting to note that Irenaeus agrees with Marcion in assuming that Luke's Gospel is the Gospel that Paul had preached. The so-called anti-Marcionite prologue has also been referred to as a testimony from the second half of the 2nd century to the Gospel of Luke and to its author. Interesting. While the canon Muratori and the prologues to the Gospel of Mark and John are most likely products of the second half of the 4th century, the first part of the prologue to the Gospel of Luke, the only one of these prologues that is preserved in its original Greek, however, may have been composed in the last decades of the 2nd century. Not in Jesus' day. Now there's a very fabulous Christian scholar who is discussing the earliest Christians' understanding of the Gospels. These are not atheists making this argument that the Gospels were not life eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. These are the Christians based on the evidences that we have from history. E.P. Sanders, the historical figure of Jesus, a very excellent scholar and a good book, says on page 63, the Gospels as we have them were not written by eyewitnesses on the basis of first-hand knowledge of Jesus. That is the conclusion of centuries of biblical scholarship and the witness of the early Christians. We do not know who wrote the Gospels. They presently have headings according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John. The Matthew and John who are meant were 2 of the original disciples of Jesus. Mark was a follower of Paul, and possibly also of Peter. Luke was one of Paul's converts. These men, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really lived, but we do not know that they wrote the Gospels. Now, another very interesting thing I've done is the Anchor Bible series on the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written by various outstanding New Testament scholars. The one on Mark is by C.S. Mann. He notes on page 80 and 81, the present writer believes, after an analysis of 80 pages concerning the discussion of the relationship of Mark with Luke and Matthew and the various types, arguments of scholars on the basis of the dating of Mark and the composition of Mark, etc. It is a rigorous analysis, has more pages than the entire Gospel of Mark, just analyzing it. He says the present writer believes that Mark's original composition drew largely on the reminiscences of Peter, along with an already formalized passion narrative. You notice he's not saying Mark wrote down the events in Jesus' life as Mark witnessed it, because that's not how Mark came about. The self-contained and highly structured pericope of this gospel have often been commented on, but it is important to try to discover in what context these pericope took shape. The suggestion here made is that Mark brought back to Palestine with him a narrative such as found in the Gospel of Mark. Not that he wrote that narrative with Jesus by his side. Now, Raymond Brown, in the Anchor Bible series version of the Gospel according to John, this is the first volume. Anybody who has ever done any kind of serious Bible study at all will know who Raymond Brown was. One of the absolute best of the best. He's not a fly-by-night atheist wanting to disprove Jesus. He says on page LXXXIV and LXXXV, the attempt of Goodenough and others to argue for an early date from comparative theology, we must admit that we find nothing in John that would demand a date before 70 AD for the final written form of the gospel, after he's analyzed it for 88 pages himself. There is a reasonably precise indication for the terminus post quem for the dating of John in the theme of excommunication from the synagogues, which, as we have seen, plays an important role in the gospel. The problem does not seem to have been acute before 70, and the datable incidents like the formulation of the 12th blessings in the Shemone Esrei and the use of formal excommunication at Jamnia belong to the period of 80 to 90 of the Common Era. The evidence makes unlikely a date before 80 AD for the final written composition of the Gospel, and indeed makes the 90s the probable era. Jesus was dead by 33 AD, I mean. He's saying this gospel didn't have its existence until the 90s. That's several generations removed from Jesus. And he's a scholar's scholar. And finally, the scholar's scholar, Joseph A. Fitzmyer. Anybody who has done any kind of serious biblical studies, an analysis, or of the Dead Sea Scrolls will absolutely recognize who this is. Joseph Fitzmyer is the king of the biblical scholars. He is also a very good Christian Catholic. To say that he is using an atheist argument is the height of absurdity and ignorance as far as I'm concerned. Fitzmyer notes in his excellent book on Luke, which is also in the Anchor Bible series, he says that a reason for the identification of the author of the Gospel of Luke as Luke stems from long-standing church tradition. And he says, the first reference can be found in the Muratorian canon. It has often been assigned a date of AD 170. The canon reads, the third book of the Gospel according to Luke. This Luke was a physician after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken him along with him as one devoted to letters. He wrote it under his own name from heresy, for he himself had not seen the Lord in person, but insofar as he was able to follow it all, he thus began his account with the birth of John. So here he says that Luke, the Muratorian canon, which dates to 170 AD, one of the early Christian canons of the Scriptures, states that Luke had not even seen the Lord, but he gathered his sources together. And in the prologue to Luke, that's exactly what we find Luke saying. I used several different sources to compile this gospel. It's not an eyewitness account, and it doesn't date to Jesus' lifetime. Luke was the companion of Paul. He set forth in a book the gospel as preached by Paul. That's Irenaeus in the Adversius Heresies. Likewise, coming from the 2nd century AD is an ancient extra-textual prologue to the Gospel of Luke. And he describes the various Jewish fables and things like that. From the beginning of the 3rd century comes the testimony from Tertullian against Marcion. He made use of the distinction of Gospels written by apostles, apostoloi, apostoli, meaning Matthew and John, and by men of apostolic times, the apostolici, Mark and Luke. The 3rd Gospel, he says, Luke, however, was not an apostle. Now, this is Tertullian, one of the early church fathers. He said Luke was not an apostle, but only a man of apostolic times. Not a master, but a disciple. Inferior indeed to a master, and at least as much better than they as the apostle whom he followed. Undoubtedly, Paul was later than the others. He called Paul's Luke an inspirer, and Luke's gospel is the gospel of his teacher. That is, Luke's gospel is a digest of Paul's gospel, but it is not an eyewitness account written by this man that has been classically identified as Luke. Fitzmyer notes, the important thing is that the text of the Lucan Gospel and what it may say to Christians that's what's important regardless of who the author was. The identification of the author of the 3rd Gospel and Acts as Luke, a Syrian of Antioch, a physician, and sometimes a collaborator of Paul, in no way necessitates an early dating. In other words, before 70 of the Common Era, or of the composition of these 2 New Testament books. In the prologue to the Gospel, Luke speaks of his dependence on the first generation of Christian disciples. Those were the eyewitnesses. Luke is using their accounts in his Gospel. He wasn't there with them. He's using their accounts. Possibly one of the 2nd generation ministers of the Word. If these are to be understood as distinct from the eyewitnesses, Luke is twice removed from the time of Jesus, and many others who undertook to write accounts of the Christian event before him. Among the latter must include Mark, whose gospel was composed about 65 to 70 AD, the earliest gospel, according to the Dean scholar of the scholars, Joseph A. Fitzmyer. The earliest gospel was 65 to 70 AD. The Lucan gospel should be dated thereafter later than the Markan gospel, and he contends that the date should be between 80 and 90 AD. He says that on page 57. There's enough evidence from the biblical Christian scholars, from the biblical Jewish scholars, and those who are familiar with the early history of the canonization of the Bible, as well as from the early Christian church fathers themselves, to show that this argument about the Gospels being later than Jesus' life, being written by those who were not eyewitnesses to Jesus, but were using the traditions about Jesus, this is not an atheist argument. Atheists may use this argument with the assumption that this disproves Jesus ever existed, but I think that argument is as silly as the argument that's been shown against me that my understanding and the scholars' understanding of the Gospels being later than eyewitness accounts is an atheist argument. That's utter pap. That is the silliest thing I do believe I've ever heard. It's absolutely false. There's no evidence to back that up. So you can be sure that when the biblical scholars are learning about the dates and compositions of the Scriptures, trying to help us understand the nature of the Bible, that they aren't out to wreck your testimony, that they're not out to try to refute anything about Jesus. They're simply trying to come to an understanding of a fundamental reality that we are very far removed from. That is all biblical scholarship is all about. And it's a very exciting adventure. So I would encourage you to seek out the best books on the Bible and begin to learn all of this wonderful information about the nature of the Bible, the nature of the people in the Bible, the church history traditions, the early Christian traditions, and what the Bible reads like, what it means, what it says. It's an absolutely astonishing, wonderful adventure.